Is to review some of the things that we learned in the last exercise and the previous one before that. So remember, we did the concrete structure where we created several profiles. Then we did the steel structure last week. So this has got a little bit of both. Once you create the levels in one elevation, here Kevin has used the south elevation. Check your other elevations out to see if you need to stretch any of the levels to match. And I think if you go here to the east elevation, you'll notice that you'll need to stretch the ends of the existing two levels to match the new ones. Yeah, the parking level one is pinned, so you'll need to unpin it first if you want to stretch it. I pinned it because I didn't want anyone to move it. The level that's listed there as parking level at level 0 was used to create the topography. So if you end up moving that level up or down, you'll end up messing up the topography. So you want to leave that level where it is typically. Okay, so I'll give everybody a few minutes here to get caught up to Kevin, and then we'll move on. So get those levels drawn, check them out in each elevation and stretch any if you need to, and then we're going to add the grids next. Again, I'm going to pause here for a few minutes just for those people that are working along, so you can get all your levels done and we're ready to go on to the next stage. Okay, how are we making out? Has everybody got those levels done? Everybody who got here on time? Well, to draw our grids and to mention our grids, let's go to the O1 parking level. So it's the level, of course, which is at elevation 0, and that's usually where you would draw your grid lines as mentioned. So I've got a couple grid lines that are already there, just to make sure that what you draw is properly aligned with the topography below. So you've got one there, it's grid line 3, and one that's grid line C. So your best bet here, maybe change your view scale to 1 to 200. That'll allow you to read the bubbles a little more easily. You can always set it back later if you need to. So I would go to the grid tool there, and to create the remaining grids, let's start by choosing the pick line tool. And we'll set a horizontal offset, and we'll offset the existing ones here. So for our first offset, let's make it 1500, and offset grid line 3 to the right, and change your offset to 6000. Okay, and offset your new grid line to the right. And then once again. Okay, and now why don't we go in and renumber those so they're correct. So the second one you made should be grid line 4. Okay, you already have one, so better go in the opposite order. Pick the last one and make it 6. That's right. And make that one 5. And that one 4. it will complain and refuse to rename a bubble if you already have one with that name. All right, so why don't we offset, go back to your grid tool, choose pick line again. This time we'll set our offset to 3600 and offset grid line C to the left. Now I'd like to take that grid line, as you can see, and stretch it down so that its tag is down about here. In order to stretch it without stretching grid line C, you need to unlock the padlocks. In other words, you select it, unlock the padlock at the end. That allows you to take the grip and stretch the grid line. You want to maintain the same angle as you do that. That's going to be grid line B. Alrighty, then we can offset grid line B to create grid line A and grid line D. So again, drawing a grid, using pick line, setting your offset to 6,000, offset B in both directions, and that will make grid lines A and D. So you'll need to relabel those. Okay, so that's the grid lines for the first pavilion and one side of the bridge. To make the other side of the bridge, we need grid lines 1 and 2, so we'll create a new grid line using pick line. This time we'll set our offset to 13,000 and create grid line 2. And change your offset to 1500 and create grid line 1. Okay, that looks good. So we've got all of those. Now, position the other grid, since this grid here, of course, is at 45 degrees, the other grid isn't. What I would do is, notice that the dimension on the page there shows equal. So what we really want to do here is we want to align the new grid along with the center line in between grid lines C and D. So whenever you want to create a line to snap to, you want to create a reference plane typically. So let's create a new reference plane by offsetting grid line C. So choose reference plane, pick line, and for our offset we want half of 3600, that would be 1800. So if you offset grid line C here to the left, that'll give you a reference plane that's halfway between C and D. Then maybe you could take the end of that reference plane and stretch it out in this direction a little further. Go a little further than that even. Now that, we don't need a reference plane there, just the one. Now that reference plane will be useful for us in the future too. We can use this to mirror some objects that are on both sides of the bridge. So we can leave it there for a while. All right, that looks good. Now, what we want to do now is align the second grid with the first set of grids. What I would do is I would just draw this new grid off to the side a little bit, then move it into position. So why don't we draw it just to the upper left of where it's going. So you maybe just draw it in this area, and then we'll move it into position. So really all you're drawing is 6 grid lines to make 4 squares. And those squares are 6,000 apart. So if you can draw 3 grid lines in this direction, 6,000 apart, and then 3 grid lines in the other direction, 6,000 apart. Here you go. And just label those. that's good. Now, we don't actually need an intersection here between, what is it, 3A and C1. We don't actually have any structure there. So if you want to shorten these, remember you've got to unlock them. You have to pick them, unlock the end, and then you can move it independently. Otherwise, you're moving all of them at once. So if you can maybe just shorten those to about halfway in between the two grids there. So shorten it to maybe about there and there. Fine. All right, so that grid's ready to move. So I would move it in 2 steps. If you can select this grid, choose move, and for your base point, say pick this intersection here, and move it to a spot somewhere on this reference plane. And now we'll move it a second time, so go back to the move tool. This time we want to go from one of these 2 intersections, this one or this one. So move from here and go perpendicular over to grid line 1. All right, so now we have this grid in alignment with the first one. Okay, so you can see on my sketch how I've aligned it. So basically you've got 3 grid lines meeting at this intersection and 3 grid lines meeting at this intersection. And this grid here, the center point, is centered on the bridge. Well, as I mentioned before, back in the good old days when we used to draw on Mylar or vellum, we used to put the grid lines on the back of the page, not the front of the page. The reason for that is if you needed to erase anything, that would make sure that the grid lines didn't get erased. So you could make changes on the front without changing or erasing the grid lines. So in Revit, we kind of do the same thing, but in Revit, we do it by pinning or locking. So let's select one grid line, doesn't matter which one, pick one of them. And then you can right-click to extend the selection to all the grid lines. Select all instances. In this case, both of these options give you the same thing. So. And now, with all of the grids selected, you can go click the push pin, and that'll pin them all at the same time, right there. So that's your push pin tool. That pins them all at once. Which means, if you want to change one in the future, like let's say if you go to a section view or an elevation view and you find out the tops don't line up, in order to adjust them so to make the tops line up, you'd have to unpin first and then you could repin them again. So when you pin something, it kind of freezes it, right? You can't change it until you unpin it first. And it's just to prevent you from moving something or stretching something by accident. We'll also dimension the grids. So throw in the same dimensions that I show. The one on the upper right, you can make that a single string if you want to. But let's add on all the dimensions that you see. And let's lock those dimensions as well. So now that means even if you unpin a grid line to stretch it up or down, you won't be able to move it left or right because it's locked. So it's nice and secure on the page. It's not going to go anywhere without an intentional change. So go ahead and throw in the same dimensions that you see there and lock them all up. And of course, dimensioning it is a good double check to make sure you got your offsets all right as well. You didn't make a typo, so you'll be able to make sure that everything's where it should be. All right, that looks pretty good. I think we've got them all there. So once you get that done, we're ready to move on to the next step. So do a save. And the next step will be to start the structure of the bridge. Now, I think for a project like this, You probably don't want to try and draw all of one building at once or all of the bridge at once. There's going to be a little bit of back and forth. So I'm going to start off with the structure of the bridge. So if you go to page 4, you can see what the bridge structure looks like. So we'll draw that next. And then I'll start drawing the 2 pavilions that connect each side of the bridge. And then we'll add all the finishing details. So we won't get it all finished today, but we'll finish it off in the next class. So what I'd like to do next is add my 4 columns for the bridge. So you notice if you look at the side view there, the southwest partial elevation, you notice we got a set of columns at grid line 2 and a set of columns there at grid line 3. The ones at grid line 3 start at the parking level, so why don't we draw those first. So you want to be on the parking level floor plan. And remember, we're making structural columns here, not architectural ones. Okay, that's important to remember. So you want to go to your structural tab and choose structural column. Then we'll need to load the family. Well, you want to go to your metric libraries, of course. So once you're in a metric library here, we know we're going to be coming back to this folder fairly frequently for the first little while. So why don't we make it a favorite? If you go down here to Tools and choose Add to Favorites, you can use this, add this folder to your favorites. So in the future, when you want to get to this folder, you can open up the Favorites folder and there's a shortcut in there that goes straight here. That'll save you a step or two when you navigate it. So you want to go down to Structural Columns. Remember, the folder that says Columns means architectural columns. Structural columns are a different family. So we'll go to Structural Columns, to Steel, and just like we did last week, we're going to use the hollow section, circular hollow section to start with. So that's the first one on the list there. And that takes you to a catalog. Okay, why does a catalog come up? Because these are families that have so many types that you wouldn't want to load all the types at once. So the catalog allows you to pick one or a few types and load them at the same time instead of loading in, there might be hundreds for some of these different families because steel is available in so many different sizes. So what we want to do here is we want to choose 660 by 32 is our size. Now, because we're going from the bottom up, we want to specify the column not by depth, but by height. Up here, we want to change that from depth to height. For our top, we're going to go up to the roof level to start with. Now, we can't change the base offset or the top offset before we draw the column. It's just the way the software works. To change the base and top offsets, you have to draw the columns first, select them, and edit them. So we're going to put the base and top offsets as close as we can to where we want them, and then we'll have to edit them later to make them exact. So your best bet here is to use the @grid tool. That allows us to specify our column locations by selecting some grids. So holding the control key down, we want to pick 3 grids. We want to pick C, B, and 3. So select all those 3 at once, and it will ghost in where your 2 columns are going. Once you see them there, click on the green check mark, and those 2 are in place. So we want the same thing happening at grid line 2. We could draw them in this view and make them the same height. In fact, I could have done that as the previous operation. However, because the base of these is closer to the main level, let's go to the main level here, and we'll draw them in that view instead. So let's go to the main level view and draw a couple more structural columns along grid line 2. So again, I would choose the @grid option here. Select grid line 2, grid line C, and grid line B. and finish them off. All right, so that's got the tops and bottoms approximately where we want them, but certainly not exactly yet. We still have to make some adjustments. As I say, you've got to put the columns in first, and then you can select them and edit their tops and bottoms. Beams are the same way. It's just the way the structural package works. But it would be nice if we could see the side of this bridge. Right now, because the bridge is at 45 degrees, we don't have a view that looks at the side of the bridge head on. Well, there's two different ways we could do it. We could put an elevation tag here that faces the bridge. That would work. Okay, remember we did the structural framing elevation last week? We could do something like that. Or if you simply want a view here that's looking in this direction, another way you could do it is with a section, right? I mean, if a section doesn't cut through something, it's not really a section, but it's still a view. But if we can draw a section in this direction facing the bridge, so we'll go to our section tool, and we start up here, somewhere about there, and go down here, make sure that you're at 45 degrees and go past grid line 3 because we want to see the whole bridge. All right, so now this will give us a view that shows us this side of the bridge. There you go. So it's just like the view in my handout. Now, in this view, we have a crop region, of course. The crop region is preventing us from seeing beyond the limits of where you drew the section. You've got two crop controls down here on the viewport toolbar. The first one determines whether it crops or not. Change it. So now you can see it no longer crops. And now the second view controls the visibility of the crop boundary. So you can hide that as well. So